No, that's a bit of a problem. See, rumor has it, the Athenians have already turned you down. And if those philosophers and boy lovers have found...
You think you know Sparta from the movies? Big muscular guys yelling about honor, throwing people into pits, and looking cool in bronze armor. Well, forget everything Hollywood taught you. Because the real Sparta had something way darker that they tried to keep secret. Something so brutal that even ancient historians barely wanted to write about it. Most people know about Sparta's crazy military training and their warrior culture. But there's one practice that makes everything else look like a friendly gamer tag. It was pure, calculated terror designed to keep an entire population living in fear. What I'm talking about is the Cryptia. And if you've never heard of it, that's exactly what the Spartans wanted. This was basically a government-sponsored murder squad that turned teenage boys into killers and made systematic execution into an art form. The story of the Cryptia is the story of how a society built its entire way of life on the backs of slaves, then created the most savage system imaginable to keep those slaves from ever fighting back. And the worst part? It worked so well that it lasted for centuries. To understand just how twisted the Cryptia was, you need to know about the Helots first. These weren't regular slaves that you could buy and sell at a market. The Helots were an entire conquered people who outnumbered their Spartan masters by at least 7-1, maybe more. The Helots were the backbone of Spartan society. They farmed the land, built the houses, made the weapons, and basically did everything that kept Sparta running, while the Spartans focused on being warriors. Without the Helots, Sparta would have collapsed in about 5 minutes. But here's the thing that kept Spartan leaders awake at night. The Helots were tough, organized, and they knew how to fight. These weren't broken people who had given up hope. They were former warriors themselves, with their own proud history and culture. The only thing stopping them from rising up was fear. So the Spartans created a system designed to manufacture that fear on an industrial scale. They turned terror into a science, and the Cryptia was their laboratory for testing just how far they could push human beings before they broke completely. The name itself tells you everything you need to know. Cryptia comes from the Greek word for hidden or secret. This was their dirty little secret that they tried to keep hidden from the outside world. The Cryptia wasn't run by hardened criminals or psychopaths. It was staffed by the best and brightest of Spartan youth. These were the top students from the Agogi, the brutal military school that every Spartan boy had to survive. The kids who had proven themselves to be the smartest, strongest, and most disciplined. Imagine that you're 18 years old, you've spent the last 11 years of your life in the most intense military training program ever created. And now your teachers tell you that you're special. You've been chosen for something important. Something that will prove you're ready to become a true Spartan citizen. But instead of getting some honor or reward, you're handed a knife and told to go kill people. Not enemies in battle, not foreign invaders, but the slaves who grow your food and build your houses. People who can't fight back, who haven't done anything wrong except be born into the wrong group. The selection process was deliberately designed to pick boys who would be effective killers. They wanted kids who were smart enough to hunt humans, athletic enough to catch them, and cold enough to murder them without hesitation. But they also wanted boys who could keep their mouths shut about what they were doing. Every year, the Ephors, Sparta's top government officials, would review the graduating class from the Agoge and handpick the candidates for the Cryptia. Being chosen was supposed to be an honor, a sign that you had what it took to protect Spartan society. In reality, it was a one-way ticket to becoming a government-sponsored serial killer. The boys who were selected didn't get a choice in the matter. This wasn't voluntary military service or some kind of special assignment you could turn down. If the Ephors picked you for the Cryptia, you went. End of discussion. Refusing would have been seen as cowardice and would have destroyed your entire family's reputation. Once you were in, there was no backing out. You couldn't change your mind halfway through and decide you didn't want to murder people anymore. The Cryptia was a commitment that lasted for an entire year, and during that time, you belonged to the state completely. Here's where things get really dark. Every autumn, according to Plutarch, the Spartan ephors would declare war on the Helot population, so that any Spartan citizen could kill a Helot without fear of blood guilt. This was a carefully planned, government-sanctioned murder spree that happened like clockwork every single year. Think about the psychology behind this ritual. The Spartans were so paranoid about Helot rebellions that they literally declared war on their own slave population annually. They created a legal loophole that made it perfectly acceptable to kill anyone they wanted, whenever they wanted, for whatever reason they wanted. The magistrates from time to time sent out into the countryside at large the most discreet of the young men, equipped only with daggers and necessary supplies. Picture these teenagers, barely out of childhood, being handed weapons and told to go hunt human beings like wild animals. They didn't get armor or shields or spears like regular soldiers, just a knife and whatever food they could carry. The boys would disappear into the countryside for months at a time, living like ghosts in the wilderness. They had to survive on their own, finding shelter, hunting for food, and avoiding detection while they stalked their targets. It was like a twisted survival reality show where the prize for winning was getting to kill innocent people. During the day, they would hide in caves, abandoned buildings, or dense forests, studying the movements of Helot communities. They learned who the leaders were, who had the most influence, who seemed most likely to cause trouble. They were building target lists for systematic assassination. At night, they became predators. They would sneak into Helot settlements, break into homes, and murder people in their sleep. Sometimes they would catch Helots working alone in the fields and kill them where they stood. Other times they would set up ambushes on roads and pathways, picking off travelers one by one. The goal was to create maximum terror with minimum effort. They wanted every Helot to go to bed, wondering if tonight would be the night that a shadow with a knife crept into their room. They wanted parents to live in constant fear for their children, and children to grow up knowing that death could come for them at any moment for no reason at all. What made the Cryptia so effective was the psychological warfare that went with it. The Spartans had figured out that fear was more powerful than chains when it came to controlling people. The randomness of the killings was deliberate. If the Cryptia had only targeted rebels or troublemakers, the Helots could have adapted by keeping their heads down and staying out of politics. But the murders were completely unpredictable. A Helot could be the most loyal, hard-working person in their community and still end up dead for no reason other than being in the wrong place at the wrong time. This created a climate where no one felt safe, ever. Helots couldn't trust each other because they never knew who might be an informant. They couldn't organize resistance because meeting in groups made them targets. They couldn't even excel at their jobs because being too successful or standing out in any way might attract attention from the Cryptia. The Spartans also made sure that the bodies were found. They wanted the Helots to see what happened to the victims, to understand that this could happen to anyone at any time. Finding a mutilated corpse in your village was a message that said, this is what happens when you forget your place. But here's the really sick part. The Cryptia members were intelligence agents too. They spent months living among the Helot population, observing, listening, and reporting back to their commanders about potential threats. They would identify natural leaders, skilled craftsmen, anyone who seemed to have influence or respect in their community. These people would be marked for death, not because they had done anything wrong, but because they had the potential to organize resistance if they ever chose to. The Cryptia maintained detailed records of Helot communities. They knew family relationships, political loyalties, economic activities, everything that might be useful for maintaining control. They were building a surveillance state that would make modern dictatorships jealous. And if you're still here learning about this nightmare fuel of ancient history, then you clearly have the stomach for some dark stuff. make sure to hit that subscribe button because trust me, we're just getting started on the messed up things ancient civilizations did to each other that somehow got whitewashed by history books. The boys who survived their year in the Cryptaea came back changed. You can't spend months hunting and killing people without it doing something to your mind. But the Spartans saw this psychological damage as a feature, not a bug. What makes the Cryptaea so terrifying is how normal it became. This was a permanent institution that operated for centuries, turning systematic murder into just another part of growing up in Sparta. Imagine being a Spartan parent watching your teenage son get selected for the Cryptaea. You're supposed to be proud that your child has been chosen for this honor. You're supposed to celebrate the fact that he's been deemed worthy of serving the state in this special way. But you also know what this means. You know that your boy, who you've raised and loved and protected, is about to spend a year learning how to be a killer. He's going to come back changed, hardened, carrying secrets that will haunt him for the rest of his life. The really sick thing is that refusing wasn't an option. A Spartan boy who couldn't handle the Cryptaea was considered unfit for citizenship. He would be marked as a coward, and his entire family would be disgraced. So parents had to smile and congratulate their sons, while inside, they were probably dying. For the Helots, the Cryptaea was just a fact of life, like bad weather or crop failures. Something terrible that happened regularly, but that you couldn't do anything about. Mothers would tell their children bedtime stories about staying quiet and staying hidden, not because of monsters or wild animals, but because of teenage boys with knives. The normalization of this system is what allowed it to continue for so long. Each generation grew up thinking this was just how the world worked. Spartans learned that they had the right to kill whoever they wanted, and Helots learned that their lives had no value beyond their usefulness to their masters. This created a society where empathy was seen as weakness and cruelty was seen as strength. The Cryptaea was producing predators who had been taught that human life was disposable and that violence was the answer to every problem. Here's the thing that should really bother you. We almost don't know about Cryptaea at all. Most ancient historians barely mentioned it, and when they did, they tried to downplay its significance or make it sound less brutal than it actually was. Why? Because even by ancient standards, the Cryptaea was too extreme to talk about openly. Sparta had allies and trading partners who might have been disgusted by the systematic murder of slaves. They had a reputation to maintain as a civilized Greek city-state, not a gang of psychopathic killers. So the Spartans kept the Cryptaea as secret as possible. They didn't write detailed records about it, they didn't put up monuments celebrating it, and they definitely didn't invite foreign visitors to watch it in action. The less the outside world knew about their murder squad, the better. Even the ancient sources we do have are often vague or contradictory. Some historians tried to present the Cryptaea as a legitimate military training exercise or a form of character building. Others focused on the survival aspects and downplayed the murder part. Almost nobody was willing to call it what it really was: state-sponsored terrorism. This historical amnesia was a deliberate effort to sanitize Sparta's reputation and make their society seem more acceptable to later generations. The same thing happened with a lot of uncomfortable historical facts. People in power rewrote the story to make themselves look better. Modern historians have had to piece together the truth about the Cryptaea from scattered references, archaeological evidence, and logical deduction. It's like trying to solve a crime where most of the witnesses are dead and the perpetrators destroyed the evidence. But the fragments we do have paint a clear picture of a society that had completely lost its moral compass. The Cryptaea not only affects the people who died, or the boys who did the killing, it poisoned the entire structure of Spartan society for centuries. When you build your civilization on systematic murder, that violence seeps into everything else you do. Sparta became increasingly isolated and paranoid as time went on. They couldn't trust their neighbors because they knew what they were capable of. They couldn't form lasting alliances because everyone knew about their brutality toward their own people. They couldn't innovate or grow because all their energy went into maintaining control through fear. the Helots never forgot what was done to them. Even though they were terrorized into submission, the resentment and hatred never went away. It just went underground, waiting for the right moment to resurface. Every Helot child grew up knowing that their parents and grandparents had been murdered by Spartan teenagers for sport. This created a society that was always on the edge of explosion. The Spartans had to maintain constant vigilance, always watching for signs of rebellion, always ready to unleash more violence to maintain control. They became prisoners of their own system, trapped in a cycle of violence that they couldn't escape. The psychological damage to Spartan society was probably even worse than the physical damage to the Helots. When you raise generations of children to be casual killers, when you teach them that human life has no value, when you reward them for brutality and punish them for compassion, you create a society of monsters. These were people who only understood force and only respected strength. They have turned themselves into predators, and predators can never truly be civilized. The irony is that the system the Cryptire was designed to protect eventually destroyed itself. Sparta's population declined, their military power faded, and their influence disappeared. The constant focus on control and violence prevented them from adapting to changing circumstances or building sustainable institutions. The story of the Cryptire should be a warning about what happens when a society decides that some people's lives don't matter. It should teach us about the dangers of normalizing violence and the long-term costs of building civilization on brutality. But instead, we've mostly forgotten about it. We remember Sparta for their military prowess and their stand at Thermopylae, not for their systematic murder of slaves. We turn them into movie heroes instead of recognizing them as the architects of one of history's most effective systems of oppression. This historical amnesia is dangerous because it allows us to repeat the same mistakes. When we glorify societies that practice systematic violence, when we admire their strength while ignoring their cruelty, we're setting ourselves up to justify similar behavior in our own time. The Cryptire worked because people convinced themselves it was necessary. They told themselves that the Helots were dangerous, that extreme measures were required, that the ends justified the means. They created a whole ideology around the idea that some people deserved to die so that others could live in security. Sound familiar? Throughout history, people have used the same arguments to justify genocide, slavery, political persecution, and systematic oppression. They always claim it's for the greater good, that it's necessary for security, that the victims somehow deserve what's happening to them. The truth is that the Cryptire made Sparta weaker by destroying their humanity and isolating them from the rest of the world. The violence they used to control others eventually consumed them from within. When we don't learn from history, we're doomed to repeat it. The Cryptire represents one of the darkest chapters in human civilization, but it's a chapter that most people have never heard of. We've allowed the perpetrators to write the story, to minimize their crimes, and to escape judgment. This matters because similar systems of oppression exist today. Around the world, there are governments that use systematic violence to control their populations, secret police forces that terrorize civilians, and societies that have normalized brutality as a tool of governance. When we don't understand how these systems work, when we don't recognize the warning signs, when we don't remember the consequences, we become vulnerable to falling into the same traps. The people who created the Cryptire were human beings who made choices, and those choices led them down a path of systematic evil. The boys who became killers in Cryptire didn't start out as psychopaths. They were shaped by a system that rewarded violence and punished compassion. They were trained to see other human beings as problems to be solved, rather than people with inherent worth and dignity. This is how genocide happens. This is how societies collapse into brutality, not through sudden madness or external invasion, but through the gradual erosion of moral boundaries and the systematic dehumanization of targeted groups. The Spartans convinced themselves that the Helots weren't really people, that they were property or animals or obstacles to be removed. Once they made that mental shift, once they stopped seeing their victims as human beings deserving of compassion and respect, the rest became easy. The most savage execution in ancient Sparta was the entire system of the Crypteia, a machine designed to produce killers and maintain terror that operated for centuries, while the rest of the world looked the other way. It was the systematic murder of empathy, compassion, and moral reasoning in service of power and control. And the worst part is that it worked so well that people are still trying to cover it up today. But now you know the truth. Now you understand what really happened in those ancient hills and valleys where teenage boys hunted human beings for sport and called it duty. Now you can recognize the warning signs and maybe, just maybe, help make sure it never happens again. Because if there's one thing the Crypteia should teach us, it's that the price of forgetting history isn't ignorance. It's the risk of becoming the very monsters we should have learned to avoid.